I love the little now recording sound effect. Yeah, anyway, so I'll start reading. Man's relation with machines takes place at the level of the function of transduction. It is in fact very easy to construct machines that ensure a much greater accumulation of energy compared to that which man can accumulate in his body. It is equally possible to use artificial systems that constitute effectors that are superior to those of the human body. But it is very difficult to construct transducers comparable to the living thing. Indeed, the living thing is not exactly a transducer like those that can be found in machines. It is that and something more. Mechanical transducers are systems with a margin of indeterminacy. Information is that which adds determinacy. But this information must be given to the transducer. It cannot invent it. It is given to it by a mechanism that is analogous to that of perception in the living, for instance by a signal coming from the manner in which the effector functions, a gauge on the output shaft of a heat engine. On the contrary, the living thing has the capacity to give itself information, even in the absence of all perception, because it possesses the capacity to modify the forms of the problems to be resolved. For the machine, there are no problems, only data that modulate the transducers. Several transducers that act upon one another according to commutable schemas, such as Ashby's homeostat, do not constitute a problem-solving machine. The transducers in a reciprocal relation of causality are all within the same time. They condition one another in actuality, dans l'actuel. They are never confronted with a problem, something thrown down before them, something that is in front of them and that they will have to step or leap over. To solve a problem is to be able to step over it, to be capable of recasting the forms that are given within the problem and in which it consists. The solution of real problems is a vital function, presupposing a recurrent mode of action that cannot exist in the machine. The recurrence of the future with respect to the present, of the virtual with respect to the actual. There is no true virtuality in a machine. The machine cannot reform its forms in order to solve a problem. When Ashby's homeostat switches by itself during the course of its functioning, one can attribute to this machine the faculty of acting on its own selectors. A jump in characteristics that eliminates all prior functioning occurs. At each instant, the machine exists in actuality, and the faculty to apparently change its forms is not very efficient, because nothing is left of the previous forms. It all happens as if there were a new machine. Each operation is momentary. When the machine changes form by switching, it does not switch in order to have this other form oriented toward solving the problem. There is no modification of forms that would be oriented by the presentiment of a problem to be resolved. The virtual does not act upon the actual because the virtual, insofar as it is virtual, cannot play a role for the machine. It can only react to something that is positively given, actually done. The living thing has the faculty to modify itself according to the virtual. This faculty is the sense of time, which the machine does not have because it does not live. So he's picking up again on what we saw, well, it was a couple weeks ago now, but in the last session, where he's making a sort of a strong distinction between the living and the technical, or between a living organism and a technical object or a machine. So he even though he earlier in the book, when he talked about the notion of concretization, he presented concretization as a sort of approximation to a living being. So a machine that becomes more and more concrete, or a technical lineage that becomes more and more concrete, it becomes more and more like a living being. But he still wants to maintain that sort of an absolute distinction. So even if it becomes closer to a living being, it never fully achieves that status of being fully concrete the way that a living being is.
It seems like the distinction between machine and the living here hinges on a unique conjunction Simondon is making between the idea of plasticity and the notion of problem.
Yeah, I think that's what I gathered from this paragraph, that the problem was a positive situation that the life encountered that was related to time as well. So problem and the conception of time, the problem and the conception of time being related here to what is essentially life and incommensurate to technical objects themselves.
Yeah, this is connected with some themes from his other main book, the individuation book, where he talks about individuation, or the transductive thinking, or the process of transductive thinking as problem solving. So one of the examples that he uses a lot is the disparation between the two ocular images. So like when you look at a scene or a picture or whatever it is, the images on your two retinas are different. And this is a sort of a problem, not exactly a contradiction in a logical sense, but it's a problem in the sense that you have two different inputs coming in, and then the organism solves that problem by producing a three-dimensional representation of the visual scene. So this adding a new dimension, or it is a sort of invention of a solution to a problem, which is the two different images. And so this same type of, he takes this as characteristic of what living beings do. Like, to be a living being is to be a being that is capable of solving problems by invention. And so he's making I think a fairly strong claim here that technical objects are inherently incapable of something like problem solving in this sense.
And there's also that little bit about according to the virtual. So that's the faculty of self-modification according to the virtual. And that relates to the sense of time as well at the very end of the paragraph. That's also interesting.
Yeah, I think that part. So again, the concept of the virtual. I think this is a reference to Bergson to some extent, or a drawing on Bergson, because he proposed this idea of the virtual as distinct from the possible. So virtual as something real, and again, this is something that Deleuze draws on as well. But the virtual as a real potentiality contained within the real world, rather than as like a sort of shadow of like the possible is conceptualized as a sort of shadow of the actual. Sorry, whereas the virtual is like a set of real potentialities that are just as real as the actual.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've always been fascinated by the concept of actuality in modal terms. There's some formal modal logics of actuality, but they're very rare to see anyone even deal with actuality. And virtuality being very tied to actuality, it would be interesting. The I don't know. I'm always fascinated by that one little point. It seems kind of like a mystery in terms of like traditional conceptualizations, which are usually restricted to possibility and necessity. But of course, modes more broadly can be unrestricted, and there can be an infinite amount of modes. So
yeah, so the point where actuality sort of poses a problem is, so this is something that Kant brought up, where he points out that the concept of $100 actual dollars is no different than the concept of $100 or like you don't add anything to the concept by calling it actual. So the concept of possibility, or the concept of 100 possible dollars and $100, there's no difference. And so it becomes sort of mysterious what exactly it is to say that something is actual in that sense. Like anything you can add to the concept is something that's shared by both the possible dollars and the actual dollars, and it's hard to make explicit what it is that you're doing when you assert actuality of that concept. And this is something, again, Hegel will draw on this, and then Bergson makes this criticism of this concept of the possible for that exact reason, because it treats the possible as a sort of copy or shadow of the actual. And so he wants to instead of using this pair of concepts, actual and possible, he wants to use the concept actual and virtual, with the virtual understood as something that is like real potentialities, or that are contained within the actual, rather than sort of shadow copies of the actual. And Simondon draws on that same he draws on that same sort of lineage, and so the virtuality. So in the individuation book, he's looking at the idea of individuation starting from something non-individual, so like a pre-individuated being, so being before individuation as containing different virtualities, and then it's actualized in the process of individuation. So it's something along those lines that he's drawing on here.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. The connection all the way back through Bergson to Hegel is interesting. Especially, I know that actuality and modal logic is relevant almost entirely because of Hegel. I'd say, like, for to the limited extent to which it's relevant in like contemporary formal modal logics.
Yeah, modal logic is something that I know very little about, but would be interested to learn more about. So if you have any sort of insights as we go along about modal logic and how it relates to what Simondon was talking about, that would be great.
Oh, I wish I did more so, but it's purely an object of fascination for me as well. I'll have to just point at it when it rubs me the right way or something. I don't really have a very clear understanding of it either, unfortunately. I know there's multiple different modal logics that all have different merits.
Yeah, and that's I think an interesting point in its own right. So maybe a little bit off topic, but the plurality of logics is something interesting. And Simondon, I think, does point to different a sort of a plural conception of logic in the individuation book as well. But sorry, I wanted to just circle back to a comment in the chat here from Ikasok. I'm not sure if that's correct pronunciation of the name there, but okay, yeah, so they don't know either, but yeah, so yeah, welcome. I'm happy to have you here. So and feel free to join on the mic if you'd like, or to put questions and comments in the chat as well. But yeah, so so the question is, with the example of the eye and inventing the problem or the solution to the problem of two images that is unique to living things, and then the question is, how is this a solution of the problem? How is this solution a unique invention rather than just a function of the eye organ in the same manner as a technical machine? And I think that's a good question. Simondon, I don't think really gives a definitive answer to this question. Because I think for him, and we discussed this in a previous session, maybe in the last one or the one before, that the development of computer technology has been so great since his time. I think there were some things that he could sort of dismiss as possibilities in his time that we can't really dismiss in the same way today. So like he can make this like strong claim that machines aren't capable of problem solving, whereas today I think that would be something a little more controversial, or at least you would have to make a better argument for it rather than just sort of dismissing it as he does. But I think maybe sort of a gesture towards an answer along the lines that he lays out would be something like the idea of solving problems, of a living being solving problems, is that there's a certain openness to it. It's not like, even when you look at a machine learning program or any type of artificial intelligence, it still has a certain you could say closedness. It's still based on a certain set of parameters that are set up in the beginning of the machine learning process, or whatever it is, and then it evolves in relation to that set of parameters that are set at the outset of the process. So if the machine learning system ends up producing garbage, it can't really tell that it's producing garbage. If something has gone wrong with the process, it can't sort of decide that, oh, this isn't working, I need to try something else. Whereas a living being that is learning how to navigate a maze or how to I don't know, how to find food or whatever it is. If their learning process is not working, or if their whatever activity they're doing is not working, they can invent a new solution to that problem and sort of re-engineer the problem, or like look at the problem from a different perspective and try something new. So I would tend to think that this is not a qualitative distinction, like a distinction of kind, but rather a distinction of degree. So there's just more flexibility and more plasticity in living beings than in current computer technology. But I think Simondon would see it as a distinction of kind. So I hope that sort of gives a sort of an answer to that type of question.
I would add, though, that it might not be entirely anachronistic to offer the kind of reductive critique of that, a kind of functionalist or operationalist critique, because, like, I mean, there were people in the 1800s who were making the same kind of arguments, like Ernst Mach, or in fact, I think Ernst Mach kind of described science as like a giant eye, the other way around. So um, I think that there's a long history of making the argument against Simondon here, that there is not anything novel about this, and there is just this kind of functionality.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't remember that bit in Mach, but he does, maybe along the same lines. He does characterize science or the functioning of intelligence as being based on a principle of least effort or something along those lines, if I remember correctly, or economy of thought, I think is the term he uses. So basically, there's sort of inputs of sensory information, and then you have to find a sort of framework to coordinate all that sensory information in the most economical way possible, which sounds a lot like the way that certain machine learning systems work today, where they have like input of information, and then they come up with some sort of um, framework for that information, and do that in the most economical way possible with some sort of function that determines the economy of a structure. So yes, I think he would see, as far as I know, which is not too far, but with the little I know about Mach, I think he would have understood this as being a continuous process rather than a sort of strict distinction between the living being and the machine.
Right. Yeah, I think he would probably just think of it all as pattern matching, so to speak, and this the function of the eye is to match the pattern of one to the other. But I get one argument you could make in Simondon's favor or defense, is that the relationship to time kind of makes it seem as though that if we have some kind of like internal time consciousness, we can offer a positive account of a difference that the purely mechanical wouldn't give necessarily. At least I'm not sure if there's any like machine learnings that give assessments of their internal time consciousness. Maybe there are, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that either. I mean, I'm not sure how exactly you would realize that within a machine learning system. Like, obviously, computers have an internal clock, but that's not the same thing as internal time consciousness. But I think that the relationship to time is a little bit like what I was getting at by talking about the way that living beings have this greater plasticity than at least today's technical objects and machine learning systems, as the sort of prime example of that. So a living being can direct itself towards a goal, like a future state, and can, based on that future state, sort of reorient itself towards the problem situation, and conceive the problem in a new way, and in order to reach that goal in a way that, to my knowledge, machine learning systems today are not capable of doing. But again, I would see that as more of a distinction of degree than of kind.
Yeah, I've even been skeptical of that criticism of the capability of machine learning systems, because you could just kind of specify a separation of domain, and then one of which is like their primary context, and one of which is like their orientational transformational context or something like that. And in which case they could just be set to optimize over both, and therefore have like the orientation needed. If in other words, you were to think of the game as like finding the adequate reasons for playing the game as like a secondary game, and then you could set it for to optimize over that what would be representative sets of those conditions, I guess. Like machine learning to kind of guess what the conditions for it to machine learn should be, or something, so to speak. But I mean, Simondon would say that there would have to be someone that actually points it to something, or gives it the capacity to point to things to begin with, and have and imbue it with that initial causal relation, which is a pretty adequate defeater, I think, of some of the more robust claims of automaton self-direction.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a distinction that's sometimes made in like cognitive science circles about derived intentionality versus original intentionality, and so the idea is that, you know, human beings at least, and other living beings probably as well, have they have this goal directedness, or intentionality in the referential sense. So you can think of, I don't know, the sun, or the center of mass of the solar system, or whatever it is. You can refer to that object outside of your own thought, or outside of language, um, and they have this original intentionality. So it's not derived from something else. Whereas in computers, insofar as you treat a computer as referring to an object or something like that, it's always secondary on a human, or potentially another animal that has that original intentionality. It's always derived from so you always interpret something, the output of a computer, as referring to the center of mass of the solar system, or whatever it is, rather than having the computer itself having that sort of original relationship to the referential object. So I think that's something along the same lines. And again, I'm not entirely convinced it's a distinction of kind rather than of degree, but yeah, I think that's something that's probably not going to be resolved just strictly through argument, but only by actually producing new types of machines that are capable of things that the current machines are not capable of. But yeah, I don't want to get too far away from the text, though. I mean, it's useful to bring up some thought experiments, and relate this to contemporary developments as well. But maybe we can go back to the next paragraph in the text if someone else would like to read.
Sure. I can read. Technical ensembles are characterized by the fact that in them a relation between technical objects takes shape at the level of the margin of indeterminacy of each technical object's way of functioning. This relation between technical objects is of a problematic type, insofar as it puts indeterminacies into correlation, and for this reason it cannot be taken on by the objects themselves. It cannot be calculated, nor be the result of a calculation. It must be thought posed as a problem by a living being and for a living being. One could express what we have called a coupling between man and machine by saying that man is responsible for machines. This responsibility is not that of the producer insofar as the produced thing comes from him, but that of a third party, a witness to a difficulty that only he can resolve because he alone has the power to think. Man is the witness to the machines and represents them in relation to one another. Machines can neither think nor experience vivre, their mutual relation. They can only act upon one another in actuality according to causal schemas. Man, as witness to machines, is responsible for the relation. The individual machine represents man, but man represents the ensemble of machines, for there is not one machine of all machines, whereas there can be a thought that encompasses all machines.
So again, he's pointing back to this claim that he's made earlier, that it's at the level of the ensemble in particular that the sort of vital function of the human being comes in, the human being as a living organism. So we have to sort of recap some of those terms. So he's making a distinction of three levels of the technical object. So there's the element, which is like a component of a technical object, and then there's the technical element, then the individual, the technical individual, which is at the same level as a human being. So that's where he has that, or he explains the function of alienation, where you have human individuals that are replaced by technical individuals, by machines, essentially. And then there's the level of the ensemble, which includes technical individuals. But and specifically at the level of the ensemble, that the human as a living being plays the sort of essential role that he's pointing to here. And I think it's also interesting that he uses this term responsible. He says man is responsible for machines. So that's it's almost a moral obligation. And he even, I think elsewhere in the book, he uses other terminology that expresses a sort of moral obligation towards machines, which is, I think, a rare. Like it's not usually we don't think of machines as something towards which you could have a moral obligation, but I think he gives the function of the ensemble, or of the incorporation of technical individuals into an ensemble, as something that is coordinated by human responsibility. And I think that's an interesting contribution.
I was just going to mention that I like the very end where he juxtaposes thought and the machine, and kind of shows that thought and the machine are incommensurate when it comes to um, self-referential totalizing functions, I guess, where you can't have a machine of all machines, but you can have a thought of all thoughts. I thought that was really striking.
Yeah, and the relation of thought as well to that moral obligation is interesting, because as Ikasak has pointed out in the chat here, that this relation of ethics might play a role in making an in-kind distinction between human beings and machines, which is an interesting idea. And I think this is something that comes up in a lot of science fiction relating to artificial intelligence. And so we discussed, I think, in the last session, how there's a sort of contradiction about the idea of automation, or of this perfect artificial intelligence. It's the idea of something that sort of mirrors human capacities in terms of being able to operate on its own without supervision from a human being. But then at the same time, it's also something that is perfectly obedient. It doesn't have its own a will of its own, and it's not something that you have any moral obligation towards. So it's like a perfect copy of a human being, except that you don't have to treat it like a human being, basically. And there's a sort of contradiction within that concept, because anything that can function can replace a human being as a worker or whatever other role, would have to at the same time have the same capacities as a human being, and would have to be treated as a person. So I think that's an interesting sort of potential line of thought to make that strong distinction that Simondon is making throughout this section. treating something as a person rather than as sort of a mere object is an in-kind distinction, probably made in the right place that he wants to make it, or in the same place that he wants to make it.
I have this hunch that what you're referring to as a difference between degree and kind, this Bergsonian difference. Whenever Simondon does something like this between the human and the machine, I think it might have something to do with the notion of values. I think it looks to me for Simondon, machines express values, certainly, but they don't create them, whereas humans seem like they are repository and creators of values. He doesn't say it that way, of course, but that's the feel I get.
Yeah, that's interesting. That ties in again with the idea of a moral obligation or an ethics of relationship to machines, and he does use the he often brings up this term axiology, like we saw that in the technical mentality paper that we read a couple months ago, and axiology is like the study of values, or the science of values, or however you want to translate it, and so the term value is definitely something that he wants to retain and use. And I think that that distinction between something that that expresses a value or that operates in relation to a value, as opposed to something that creates values, I think that's probably another way of expressing the distinction between something that you have that you don't have moral obligations towards, and something that you do have moral obligations towards. So a person, as someone that we have moral obligations towards, would be an entity that can create values. I think that's those two distinctions probably coincide. So that's another interesting way of posing that distinction. Right, and Ikasak has pointed out in the chat that creation of values would also tie in with the idea of invention as solving a problem. So, if a living being is a being that invents the solution to a problem, that would at the same time seem to be some sort of or the creation of values would be an instance of that type of invention. I think invention probably always has to do with a value of some kind. It's only an action is only an invention insofar as it's related to a value of something, that it's you're creating something better. So yeah, that's an interesting tie back to our earlier discussion. Okay, so I can continue with the next paragraph. One can call a technological attitude that which compels man to look after not only the utilization of a technical being, but after the correlation of technical beings among each other. The current opposition between culture and technics comes from the fact that the technical object is considered identical with the machine. Culture does not understand the machine. It is inadequate to technical reality because it considers the machine to be a closed block, and it considers mechanical functioning to be an iterative stereotypy. The opposition between technics and culture will last until culture rediscovers that each machine is not an absolute unit, but only an individualized technical reality that is open according to two paths, that of the relation to elements and that of the inter-individual relations within the technical ensemble. The role culture has assigned to man alongside the machine is at odds with technical reality. It assumes that the machine is substantialized, materialized, and consequently devalued. The machine is in fact less consistent and less substantial than culture assumes. It does not relate to man as a single block, but through the free plurality of its elements, or the open series of its possible relations with other machines within the technical ensemble. Culture is unjust toward the machine, not only in its judgments or its preconceptions, but at the very level of knowledge. The cognitive intention of culture towards the machine is substantializing. The machine is closed up in this reductive vision that considers it to be perfect and finished in itself, that makes it coincide with its actual state, with its material determinations. With respect to the art object, such an attitude would consist in reducing a painting to a certain expanse of dried and cracked paint on a stretched canvas. In regard to the human being, the same attitude would consist in reducing the subject to a fixed series of fixed set of vices and virtues or character traits. And there's a footnote here. This reductive attitude can also exist toward an entire region, regionalism. Actually, I'll just read the next paragraph because it looks like it's just tied in as well. To reduce art to art objects, to reduce humanity to a series of individuals that are mere carriers of character traits, is to act as one does when reducing technical reality to a collection of machines. Yet, in the first two cases, this attitude is judged crude. In the second case, it passes for being in conformity with the values of culture, although it operates with the same destructive reduction as it does in the first two cases, except that it operates by making an implicit judgment through knowledge itself. It is the very notion of the machine that is already distorted, like the representation of the foreigner, étranger, in group stereotypes. So we have the term value that came up again in this paragraph. So that was a good suggestion. So he brings up the idea of values and treating machines treating a technical object as identical with the machine. He compares this to treating an art object as just some paints dried onto a piece of stretched canvas, or treating a human being as a fixed set of characteristics, and even comparing it to racism or xenophobia, which is an interesting, it's a strong comparison. But it's interesting to think that that there could be the same degree of misunderstanding in treating the technical object as a fixed machine, as there is in treating different nationalities or ethnicities as having this sort of fixed set of characteristics. That's a very strong claim, but it's an interesting one as well.
Yeah, definitely could be looked at as like a criticism of kind of demographic statistics or something like that, right? Where you just think where you have like let's think about what this person is. Like they have this property, and this property, right?
Yeah, and I think Simondon would say that that's not. He doesn't want to reject those types of or that type of knowledge where you can say people in this age group have this tendency or something like that. I don't think he would want to say that that's like inherently wrong or something like that. But it's just that if you reduce a human being to say like they have this set of properties, age, gender, nationality, whatever, sort of a fixed set of properties, and you say that therefore they have this characteristic because they have these properties, that's just it's a reduction of the complexity of a human being down to something that's too simple, and it's not treating them as a human being as such, as someone who can invent new values or new solutions to problems and so on. So someone that might have certain characteristics by virtue of belonging to a certain age group, for example, they can decide to change that characteristic, or they can be put into a new situation where they have to adapt in a different way, for example. So those reducing a person to those characteristics is just not treating them as a person, really.
And this because you wouldn't be taking seriously their value creation capacity.
Right, I think that's right. I think that's what Simondon would say, in the capacity to invent something new, and in relation to values that they create themselves. Yeah, would someone else like to read the next paragraph?
I can go.
Sure, go ahead.
However, it's not the foreigner as foreigner who can become the object of cultured thought, but only the human being. The stereotype of the foreigner cannot be transformed into a just and adequate representation unless the relation between the being who judges and the one who is the foreigner is diversified and is multiplied in order to acquire a multiform mobility that confers upon it a certain consistency, a definite power of reality. A stereotype is a two-dimensional representation, like an image, without depth and plasticity. For the stereotype to become a representation, the experience of the relationship with the foreigner must be multiple and varied. The foreigner is no longer foreign, but other, when there are foreign beings not only with respect to the subject who judges, but also with respect to other foreigners. The stereotype falls away when this relation of man to the foreign is known in its entirety between other people, rather than enclosing the subject and the foreigner within an asymmetrical, immutable mutual situation. In the same manner, the stereotypes relating to the machine cannot change unless the relation between man and machine, an asymmetrical relation for as long as it is viewed as an exclusive relation, can be seen objectively in the process of producing itself between terms that are independent of the subject, between technical objects. In order for the representation of technical contents to be incorporated into culture, an objectivation of the technical relation must exist for man.
All right, so this is it's a little bit, I think, abstract, this paragraph, but the idea, as far as I can understand it, is that when you, as the subject, are in relation to the foreigner, then you can't have an accurate depiction of the foreigner, but it's only by varying that relationship, and then having a depiction of the relationship to the foreigner itself. So not you as the subject related to the foreigner, but the foreigner related to another foreigner, for example. Um, then you can depict the actual relation. You can have a representation of that relationship itself rather than being one of the terms of the relationship. So in the same way, in understanding technical reality, if you are one of the terms of that relationship, then you can't have a depiction of the relationship itself. It's only as the living being setting up the ensemble, or thinking at the level of the ensemble, that you can actually represent the technical relationship between different technical objects, and then have an understanding of that relationship.
Yeah, I'm afraid this is a little obscure for me, especially the last little bit.
Yeah, I think it's the asymmetry of the relationship that is the sort of the key point. Is that so? When you, as the subject, are one of the terms of the relationship, either to the foreigner or to the machine, then you have sort of the relationship is asymmetrical in the sense that you are the judge, and then the other entity is the judged entity. Um, and then it's only by sort of stepping out of that relationship that you can have a fuller picture of that entity. So rather than depicting someone as a foreigner, you can just depict them as another person, and your relationship to them is one relationship among many that they have to their family or other people from their country, or from your country, and so on. Um, and the same way that to have a fuller picture of technical reality that's not just this two-dimensional flat depiction, you have to sort of step outside of that relationship, that asymmetrical relationship of the judge to the judged, and you have to allow for that relationship between technical objects to be represented itself.
Yeah. I'm trying to grasp how this all works out, because there's a lot of familiar terms, and I'm inclined to think this is a explanation of a kind of conceptual independence, which is oftentimes kind of talked about as an objectiving or objectivation or objectivity or something like that. The object term is often used when there's some kind of conceptual independence in especially kind of idealist theories, I guess. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure how everything works out here, but it seems like there's some sense in which there's the kind of stereotypical machine relation in which machines are these kind of abstract blocks, and then there's this like conceptual independence of objective machines. And this I don't know, I can't really make much broader work into describing the picture than that, I'm afraid, but that's pretty much what I'm working with the end of this paragraph here.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's conceptual independence precisely. I think what he's getting at is more a sort of conceptual richness, so that when like in the relation of xenophobia, you have a representation of this person as a foreigner, and whatever stereotypes follow from that. So this person comes from X country, therefore they have these qualities, usually negative ones, um, and what he's getting at here is by having that sort of by stepping out of that relationship of the judge to the judged object, you allow for a richer concept of that person, and treating them as a person rather than as a representative of that nationality or whatever other characteristic you're reducing them to. So you can represent them as not just as this foreigner, but as another person that you can relate to. And I think the same idea is what he's pointing to with the machine, or with the technical object, I should say. So that treating the technical object as this abstract entity that's fixed, the sort of black box approach, means that you again, you're just sort of reducing it to a fixed set of characteristics, whereas stepping out of that relationship and understanding its relation to other machines and in the full ensemble, the technical ensemble, allows you to have a richer concept of that machine, or of that technical object. Yeah, it's a little bit abstract, I think, but maybe, yeah, I think it will maybe be a little bit clearer as we go along. But before we move on to the next paragraph, I just wanted to point to Ikasok's comment or question in the chat here. So is the idea that the cultural view of machines, which Simondon seems to be opposed to, is an asymmetrical one, or culture imposes an asymmetrical relationship between human and man, or I guess between human beings? So I would say it's not so much that Simondon is opposed to this cultural view, or sorry, between man and machines. Yes. So it's not so much that Simondon is opposed to this cultural view, but he thinks that culture as it exists today has this impoverished relationship to machines, and to technical objects in general. And he wants to. So this is something that he sort of introduced in the introduction to this book, the idea that culture has to sort of expand to include the technical reality, as well as so he points to like art as something that is has a sort of status within culture. So like someone who treated art, like a painting from Van Gogh or whoever, as just some splotches of paint on a piece of canvas, you would treat them as like not cultured. There's someone who doesn't really understand the cultural significance of this object. But at the same time, we accept someone who treats technical objects as just this black box, fixed set of characteristics. We accept that as something that is part of that's like acceptable in our culture. And so he's arguing that culture has to expand to recognize the human reality within technical objects in the same way that we recognize the human reality within an art object, rather than just viewing it as a piece of material. So our present day culture imposes this asymmetrical relationship between human beings and machines, but he wants to, or he's arguing that we need to transform our culture in order to eliminate that asymmetrical relationship.
Right, and I guess this is where I was getting the drawing in the dependence and independence distinction, because the asymmetrical relation would be one in which there's a dependent relationship, that this being on the cultural milieu or whatever forces there are that um, that that are causal in relation to the stereotypes. Whereas what is necessary in him is for Simondon is this process of producing, which creates an objectivity which is independent of the subject, by or in that is in relation to terms that are independent of the subject, rather, is the phrase that he uses. But this is to kind of show that there's the kind of independence necessary for this objective objectivation, I guess, of the technical relation. I don't know. That's the best I can do with now. I think I got a little bit better idea. At first, when I was looking at it, I had no clue what was going on there. But I think that there's a certain like he's seeing a kind of dependency, or a certain kind of necessity, and he's saying, well, in spite of this, what is, like, we still should do this other thing. I guess we should strive for this independence, or this objectivity that casts itself in the productive role of the subject between independent terms, I guess.
Yeah, I think I see a little bit better what you mean by dependence and independence. So yeah, that makes more sense. But I think, regardless of some of the details of this passage, I think the sort of broader points is that he wants to compare the sort of general or current attitude towards machines with xenophobia, and I think that's a very striking comparison, and again points back to the what we were talking about earlier about an ethics or a moral relationship to technical objects, because xenophobia, of course, is something that is, you know, not treating a human being as someone you have moral obligations towards because of their nationality or ethnic background or whatever it is. So I think that's again pointing back towards that moral obligation towards technical objects, which is sort of a key feature of this section, I think. So maybe we can go on to that last paragraph of this section if someone else would like to read.
Sure, I'll go ahead and finish it off. It's fairly short, so. The predominant and exclusive attention to a machine cannot lead to the discovery of technicity, any more than the relation with a single sort of stranger or foreigner can allow one to penetrate the interiority of their way of life and to know it according to culture. Even interaction with several machines is not enough, any more than successive interactions with several foreigners. These experiences only lead to xenophobia or to xenophilia, which are opposite but equally passionate attitudes. In order to consider a foreigner through culture, one needs to have objectively seen the relation whereby two beings or foreigners to one another play out. Likewise, if a single technics does not suffice to offer cultural content, neither does a polytechnics. It merely engenders the tendency towards technocracy or the refusal of technics as a whole.
So it's interesting. This is a little bit of clarification of the last paragraph. That so it's not just that. So it's not just relationships to many foreigners that allows you to overcome xenophobia, it's stepping outside of that relationship of the subject to the foreigner. Or that asymmetrical relationship, because you yourself are a foreigner to the other person as well. So it's a symmetrical relationship rather than asymmetrical. So in the same way, this like a polytechnics or a relationship to many machines doesn't make you necessarily overcome that asymmetrical relationship with the machine. You have to step out of that asymmetrical relationship, and sort of ascend to the level of the ensemble, so that you can look at the technical relationship between the different machines and technical objects.
Yeah, this makes a lot more sense now. It's all coming. All the pieces are coming together. I can kind of see how what he was talking about earlier with the categorical distinction between the concept and the machine, um, kind is kind of being fleshed out now by a broad picture of what is necessary for the concept and the role that gives it its characteristic independence from the machine, which is this kind of characteristic independence. It's not that, and well, it's not there can just be like a multiple like a sampling problem that therefore it's not just an issue of quantity of it's not as though like you can just add more technical objects and overcome the problem, um, but there needs to be something which is in excess of that, I guess, which is I would describe as an independent factor, which is kind of um, what traditionally what kind of gives the concept um, a power for truth bearing, I guess. What makes it gives it a power to say do anything consequential when it comes to an object is that the concept and the object kind of need to be in agreement, and this is for them to be in truth, right? And I think that this is the kind of concept of truth, I guess, that is I would say is kind of implicit in this broad conceptual account that Simondon is offering, that the concept must be brought to accordance with the object and must be in agreement on the same terms with the object. And this is something which the machine can't be brought into agreement on the same terms with the object. So it's excluded on that basis. So I think that this goes to show a lot of why that distinction is necessary, or how he's using that distinction earlier of concept to machine. And also in this paragraph, he mentions not only xenophobia but xenophilia, which I'm guessing is sort of kind of like a exoticism or something like that, right? Of like of the other.
Yeah, so that would just be, so I mean the Greek term would just mean love of the other, or love of the foreigner. So yeah, exoticism would be a perfect example of that, where you treat someone as sort of, rather than treating someone as inherently bad or giving them negative qualities because they're foreign, you treat them as having these positive qualities because they're foreign, rather than just treating them as a person.
To do some close reading and to take him at his word, I think what's not quite right with both of them, xenophobia and xenophilia, is that they are passionate. So the objectivity he is gesturing toward here is something that is supposed to be devoid of passion.
Yeah, that's right. That's an interesting. I hadn't sort of picked up on that word passionate, but yeah, he characterizes them as being passionate. That's what is negative about them. So he's pointing towards a dispassionate relationship to other people, and also to the machine, or to technical objects in general. Um, Again, I think this probably can be tied back to the introduction, where he's talking about how we have these sort of passionate attitudes towards the machine, of whether it's loving the machine or hating the machine. Um, so like a technocratic attitude of loving the machine, or a technophobic attitude of hating the machine. Um, Both of those attitudes are insufficient to sort of have a proper grasp of the technical reality, and it's only a dispassionate attitude that allows you to have a proper grasp of it. So that would be a pretty the sort of a traditional understanding of the role of the passions in knowledge, which you can find in like Descartes or someone like that, like about how you need to sort of eliminate the role of the passions in order to have objective knowledge, which it's interesting that he's sort of reappropriating that traditional understanding of the relation between the passions and knowledge.
I just remarked, interesting.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different of traditions that this kind of like harkens back to. Like at first I was thinking like a stoic kind of detachment from the passions, but then I was thinking about the kind of conceptual bracketing of the skeptics. Also kind of has this purpose of, similar to Descartes, kind of for the purpose of investigation, removing cognitive biases and such. And even the phenomenological method kind of maintains this classical skeptical attitude, at least for the early phenomenologists. So
yeah, again, that's why I sort of just called it traditional in a broad sense, because you can point back to all kinds of Greek examples, and then throughout early modern philosophy and so on. This is like the probably the prevalent or the standard view throughout most of the history of Western philosophy, is that you have a you know something better insofar as you are not related to it passionately, but you have a dispassionate relationship to it. And I think that's something open to question. I would be a little bit skeptical of that claim. I think there are, especially when we're talking about relationships to another human being, I would say that a passionate relationship to a human being is probably part of what it means to know a human being in the full sense, but that's probably leading away from the text a little bit.
right, and the argument could be immediately made in the other sense that the passions could obscure your appreciation of the other human being or something, right? So I can see the argument splitting both ways when it comes to passions.
Yeah, that's. I think maybe this would be a good place for us to stop, unless you want to go forward. But we had more discussion today than I was expecting, which is good. It's just great. That's what the whole point of the group is, to discuss things, right? So maybe we can stop here and then pick up with section 4 next time, if that's all right with everyone.
Well, the point of the group is got to be in excess of our descriptions of it, our purely mechanical descriptions, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, this sounds like a good place to stop. I actually have to leave a little bit early today too, so and this will leave a lot of good conversation time for after we finish this 4th section next time.
Yeah, I think we could also potentially, depending on what other people are interested in, but we can read the 4th section and then do something like a recap of the whole part 2 of the book, since we're going to finish it next time, hopefully, if everything goes according to plan.
It's fairly short, so I think we should probably finish next time, I imagine.
Okay, well, that's great. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you again to 61 for editing and posting the recordings. So this one should be up sometime in the next few days as well, I would expect.
Yeah, I'll try to get it up sooner. The last time I was uploading it, and I closed my browser window, and it never got uploaded, so I had to go and re-upload it. But yeah, no, I'll try to get it up fairly soon, and I'll see y'all next week.
Okay, great. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.